These are some of the comments that Danelle leaves to her subs on TikTok. You can tell when somebody's lying when they say so-called fiber. It wasn't a so-called fiber, it was a fiber. And that so-called fiber was never proven to be consistent with a screen. It's very suspicious. This is what she wants to sell to her subs, that it's never been proven to be consistent with the screen. It's very, because the serrated knife is what tells most people that there was no intruder. The serrated knife was taken from her block and used to cut that screen in a T shape in the back of her garage. That would mean that an intruder got in the house, got the knife, cut the screen, put it back, and then got the butcher knife and did his killings. That's what that would mean. She says the so-called fiber was never proven to be consistent with the screen. It's very suspicious. Received into the laboratory on June 8th, 1996. Because Cron, once he saw that knife, the butcher knife, was on the counter there, he had all the knives in that block examined. Exhibit 22, butcher with eight knives had been processed for latent prints prior to being received. The 6 knives processed are as follows: 7-inch paring knife, 9-inch paring knife, 7.5-inch paring knife, 7 3/4 butcher knife, 9 1/8 fillet knife, and a 12-inch bread knife. So they were taken in as evidence and they were examined. Part of the testimony is right up here is where they say that they took the knives that was found in a butcher block in her kitchen, still in a butcher block, and that knife was examined. Those two very same substances, both fiberglass rods found in the window screen and the black rubber material, was found in the blade of that knife. It also had a black rubber material that you use to push the screen in when you put a new screen in. It's got this little, of the top. It's got this, and around the edges, it's got this rubber material that's used to hold it in place. That was also found on the blade of the knife. Conclusions from the court are: the court finds that the fibers in from the fingerprint brush used by the Rowlett Police Department at the crime scene were not consistent with the debris found on the knife. The fibers from the brush were of 25% greater diameter than the screen fragment fibers, 12.5 microns as opposed to 10 microns. What the supporters will tell you is, well, he did the screen first with that fingerprint brush, and then he went over and did the knives. So that that fiber that they found, that was from the fingerprint brush. That wasn't from the screen. But of course, they tested it, and the fingerprint brush was much thicker, and that so-called fiber was never proven to be consistent with the screen. What she means is Charles Lynch worked for Swiffus. He was a trace analyst for Swiffus, and he was the one that did the testing on that. And regarding the fiber, he did say that he recommends more testing be done on the fiber to make sure. All right. He didn't mention anything. He didn't say there was any more testing needed to be done on the rubber seal. They were sure that that came from the window. So he said, in his honest opinion, that more testing needed to be done. So she says it's never proven to be consistent because of the more testing that they said needed to be done. But she can't explain the rubber seal. She can't explain the rubber seal at all that came from the window. There's no reason for it to be there. Charles Lynch, a trace analyst with the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences, and Donnell believes in science, received a butcher block with 8 knives from the Routier's kitchen. He examined each knife individually but found fiber evidence only on the serrated bread knife. After removing those fibers to a microscope, he conducted 10 to 15 test cuts in an additional screen from the Routier's garage. Each and every time he ended up with fiberglass rods that were in every way microscopically identical to the one recovered from the bread knife. He also ended up with rubber debris and glass particles embedded in a dark pigmentation of all which were in every way microscopically identical to the debris recovered from the bread knife. Lynch looked for other possible sources of fiberglass in the house, such as packing tape, computer circuit boards, insulation. The only thing he found was some burned fiberglass in the upstairs fireplace. But it was a very different type of fiberglass from the screen. What made his finding so compelling was the combination of fiberglass rods and rubber material on the bread knife. From testimony, Greg Davis asked, Mr. Lynch, when you found the fiberglass and the rubbery material on that knife blade and you found the same material in that window screen, did you look at other sources of fiberglass? Lynch, yes, in looking at other sources of fiberglass, I didn't find the fiberglass in combination with the material, rubber dust particles, that was the same as the screen. Lynch also testified at the bottom of that defect, meaning the vertical cut of the T in the garage window screen, the fibers were denuded, D-N-U-D-E-D, and in an extreme more fashion than up at the top. So that is consistent with a serrated knife withdrawal from the screen. It was jagged. The serrated knife's got teeth on it, so when he pulled it out, they were denuded or denuded. Let's look up what that word means. I've never seen that before. Denuded. So if I'm not sure of something, I'll look it up. Strip something of its covering, possessions, or assets to make bare. So again, what he says, at the bottom of that defect, he means the T cut in the garage window screen. The fibers were denuded and in more extreme fashion than up at the top. So that is consistent with a serrated knife withdrawal from the screen. That came from Lynch. You can see that in the trial testimony that Donnell now leads us to the transcripts. First, Donnell says they were all messed up. They were blah, 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 but they're not. The court ruled and fixed them with audio tapes. The court ruled that they're not messed up. And they're not. If you could tell us what's missing from that, if you have any person that testified on that stand that said, I did not say that, that's not what I said, let us know. Our cross-exam mostly employed a multi-pronged approach. First, he tried to raise doubt by emphasizing the different amount of each material produced by the test cuts. Why was there only one fiberglass rod on the bread knife, but 3 or 4 rods when Lynch conducted his test? That's a good question. From the testimony, Mosty. But the last two tests, the rubber dust is similar from the test to the knife. But the fiberglass rods are dissimilar from the test to the knife. Lynch. Only in the number found. Mosty. Right. So in that sense, the testing was inconsistent with what was found on the knife. Lynch. Not necessarily. You can't expect to do a test and have exactly the same amount of debris wind up on the examining table. Mosty. So you could draw the conclusion that what you found on the screen was inconsistent with your testing? Lynch. No, it's not inconsistent. It's very consistent. That's what Lynch said during the trial. An expert, trace analyst. Lynch meant that because his test knife went directly from the screen to the examining table, there was less opportunity for any fiberglass to fall off. See, from the window to the knife block, she would have to go, out the garage, and back in the garage, through two doors, make a right, and put it right there back into the block. So there was an amount of travel that that it would had to hang on. The the fiber had to hang on to the knife from the window to the block. What he's saying is that there was more debris because he simply tested the knife and put it right back down. Some of the serrated knife, if the knife block was right next to the window, would have had more fibers on it. State's theory that Darlie used the bread knife to cut the screen and then carried it back to the kitchen. In that scenario, some of the fiberglass would fall off as the knife she moved from one room to the other. Mosty then turned his attention to the rubber dust particles found on the bread knife. Mosty. And you couldn't run a test like DNA on that dust? Lynch. There's a test that can be done. I wasn't able to get those things removed to the proper surface in order to do the test. I attempted, but I couldn't do it. Mosty. So there wasn't enough to run a scientific test to determine whether or not that was a particular type of rubbery material? Lynch. That's correct. The absolute chemical identification of that rubber dust was not accomplished because the particles were too minute. Mosty. Okay, those are the molecular structures that you were not able to observe. Lynch. Nobody would be able to. Mosty. And I don't fault you for it. Lynch. Well, no. Charles Lynch could not ascertain the exact molecular structure of the rubber dust particles, nor could the defense, for that matter. But he did go beyond a simple microscopic comparison. He used a polarized light microscopy to confirm that the particles on the knife, as well as the particles on the test cuts, were synthetic polymers, and that nylons, polyesters, rayons, and acrylics were excluded. In addition, the pigment of the rubber dust material was consistent with the color of the window screen. Now keep in mind the fiberglass rod and the rubber debris were found within the serration grooves. They were stuck in the groove. It was stuck, which is more consistent with the bread knife actually coming into contact with the screen rather than the screen debris somehow finding its way back to the butcher block. Both the prosecution and the defense questioned Lynch regarding the possibility that the fibers on the bread knife were actually from Charles Hamilton's fingerprint brush. Davis. Greg Davis asked. Fingerprint brushes. Are they also made of fiberglass? Lynch. Yes, they are. Davis. Did you obtain a fiberglass brush from Rowlett? Lynch. Yes, from Officer Hamilton. Davis. All right. Did you compare the fiberglass that made up his fingerprint brush with the fiberglass that you found on the knife blade and screen also? Lynch. Yes, I did. The fiberglass rods that make up the fingerprint brushes are much bigger than the rods that make up the screen. So they are very, very different. So according to Lynch's testimony and his testing of the fiberglass rod from the screen and the fingerprint brush, we can now throw it out. Oh, I think that was a fingerprint brush, Rich Prater. You're not an expert trace analyst with Swiftus. So in conclusion, Darlie is grossly misrepresenting what was found on the bread knife. It wasn't simply a fiber. It was a combination of a fiberglass rod, glass particles, and a dark rubbery material unique to the screen. Her claim that it was not definite refers to the fact that Charles Lynch, or any witness testifying about the fiber evidence for that matter, is prohibited from stating that something is a match. Absent witnessing the actual transfer of a fiber to the surface, no fiber examiner in the world would say that fiber A conclusively came from item B. Does that mean the fiber evidence had no value? Of course not. In combination with the other circumstantial evidence, it was a powerful corroboration that the bread knife from the Routier's butcher block cut that screen. Post-trial, Darlie's writ of habeas corpus stated that the defense experts have concluded that the source of the fiber was fingerprint powder used to dust the knives recovered from the Routier residence. To support their claim, the defense cited two sources: Charles Lynch's trial testimony and his 2002 affidavit attached to the writ. Lynch testified at trial when he received a butcher block, neither the block nor the bread knife had been fingerprinted. The knives on either side of that empty slot that held the butcher knife had been dusted for prints. In his affidavit 5 years later, however, he stated that all the knives had been dusted for fingerprints before he received them. Lynch was simply mistaken in his affidavit, probably due to passage of time. His trial testimony is likely to be much more accurate than an affidavit made 5 years and probably hundreds of cases later. It is unclear when the two knives flanking the empty slot were fingerprinted, but it was not done at the crime scene. Charles Hammond had testified to every single item he dusted for prints, and the knives were not among them. The remaining knives included the bread knife, were not fingerprinted. They were sent to Lynch in the Trace Evidence Lab on June the 8th. After his testing was completed, on June the 10th, the butcher block and the knives went to the Dallas Sheriff's Lab, where Roger Smith dusted them for fingerprints on June the 11th. So Lynch had them on the 8th. They were dusted on the 11th. So the rubber dust material Lynch found on the bread knife could not possibly have been for fingerprint powder, because they weren't done yet. But just for argument's sake, let's assume that the bread knife was dusted before Lynch received it. First, Darlie's appellate lawyers would have to prove that the fingerprint powder is consistent with the rubber debris Lynch identified. If they passed that hurdle, they would still need to account for the fiberglass rod. The same fiberglass rod that couldn't have come from a fingerprint brush. Now, here recently, Danelle's been telling us, go read the trial transcripts, go study them. Well, I just did. I've seen that before, but it's been a long time. So you can't gaslight or lie to the public and say, and that so-called fiber was never proven to be consistent with the screen. Because it was by an expert. And your last video said that you believe in science. Well, there's some science for you right there. Do I sound uneducated? Do I sound like I'm a 600-pound person in in the basement eating ramen noodles? Do I sound that way? And how would you know what ramen noodles were? Actually, they're good if you mix some things with them. My kids like them. You're very suspicious. Very, very suspicious. Very, very. I would do anything for my sister.